I was born in 1910 in a small town near Bologna, nestled between the hills and the countryside where the rhythms of life moved slower than the cities. It was a time when Italy was still recovering from the war, and I can remember my father speaking in hushed tones about the days of unrest. He had fought in the Great War like many men of his generation, and the scars of that time were still fresh. Life for us was simple, modest. My father was a farmer, and my mother ran the household with the care and devotion that only mothers know. Politics, however, was something that hovered at the edges of our lives until 1922. Before I continue, remember to like and subscribe if you are interested in stories like this. I remember it as if it were yesterday when the news arrived that Mussolini's fascist forces had marched on Rome. It was October 28, 1922. At the time I was only 12, still too young to fully grasp the implications of what was unfolding, but I could feel the tremor of change in the air. The news was everywhere. The whole country seemed to buzz with anticipation. My family had lived in this small town for generations, but the outside world was beginning to creep in, and you could feel the excitement, but also the fear stirring in the air. When Mussolini and his black shirts took to the streets, marching in lockstep towards the capital, it felt like a moment of destiny. We were told the march was to restore order, to revive Italy's greatness. As a child, it sounded like the beginnings of a grand adventure. Italy would rise, become powerful again as it had once been in the days of ancient Rome. My friends and I mimicked the black shirt salute, raised our arms proudly in imitation of our future leader. For the first time I heard people speak of Mussolini as a savior, a man who would restore Italy to the glory it had lost. I recall the first time I saw the propaganda posters of Il Duce, his strong face staring down at us as if commanding us to follow. The slogan, Mussolini il Duce, seemed to be everywhere, on banners, painted on walls, printed on newspapers. There was an air of reverence that accompanied these images. We were being told that Mussolini was Italy's father, guiding us toward a new age of strength, pride, and power. My father, usually reserved, spoke more openly about Mussolini's promises, but there was a certain wariness in his eyes. He had fought in the trenches during the war and had seen the emptiness of political promises firsthand. But his reluctance didn't stop the excitement that gripped the rest of us. At school, we were soon taught the values of fascism. We learned about the greatness of ancient Rome and how Mussolini's regime would revive that greatness. The teachers spoke of unity, strength, and discipline. We were taught to respect Il Duce, to salute his image with pride. I was part of the Opera Nazionale Balilla, the fascist youth organization, which became a dominant force in my teenage years. I would march in line with the other boys in our black shirts and shorts, singing songs of loyalty to Mussolini. Looking back, it felt like a childhood dream. We were soldiers for the state, and the state was our protector, our guide. At home, things were quieter. My mother spoke little of the politics of the time, but my father would occasionally speak about Mussolini in the evenings when the family gathered for dinner. His words were cautious, always measured, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. It was not fear of Mussolini himself, but fear of the unseen consequences of this new order. It wasn't until much later that I began to understand what those consequences would be. In 1922, the rise of fascism felt like the dawn of a new era.
The excitement in the streets was palpable, and the promises of greatness seemed within reach. For a child like me, it was an intoxicating vision. We were told that Italy would be restored to its rightful place in the world, powerful, united, and respected. We were the generation that would rise with Il Duce and help restore Italy to its former glory. But beneath the surface of this excitement, I could feel a different, quieter undercurrent. Something more dangerous than the enthusiasm of the streets, something that would come to shape the years to come. Fear. It was a fear that would hang over us like a shadow, a fear of saying the wrong thing, of speaking out against the regime. Even as I marched in the streets with the other children, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen to those who didn't join in, to those who opposed Mussolini's vision for Italy. But as a young boy, those questions were drowned out by the louder, more vibrant voices around me. The excitement of the moment was too much to ignore.
By the time I turned 15, Mussolini's grip on Italy was complete. It felt like the country had been reshaped, turned into something new, something different. I had long since traded my childhood curiosity for the uniform of the fascist youth, and I became one of the many boys who pledged loyalty to Il Duce, attending the weekly marches, singing the anthems, and learning the values that the regime wanted to instill in us. We were told to work for the state, to serve the nation, to put aside individual desires for the collective good. Everything revolved around Mussolini, around the regime's vision of Italy. There were no questions. There was no room for doubt. The posters were everywhere. The image of Mussolini towering over us, reminding us of the greatness we were meant to embody. At school, our teachers no longer taught us about science or literature. Instead, they focused on history rewritten in the fascist image. We learned about Rome and the greatness of our ancestors, but we were also taught that Italy's future rested on Mussolini's shoulders. The idea of loyalty to Il Duce became ingrained in us like a second nature. The youth organizations were more than just a form of entertainment or sport. They were institutions designed to reshape the minds of the next generation. The regime worked hard to make us believe that we were part of something bigger than ourselves, that Italy's future depended on our obedience. I remember one of my first encounters with the fascist ideals of masculinity. We were taught that men should be strong, disciplined, and obedient, that emotion had no place in a true Italian man. Mussolini wanted us to be proud, not just of our country, but of our new identity. Fascism was about unity and strength. Anything else was weakness. The world outside, meanwhile, was changing in ways I couldn't ignore. The economic situation in Italy wasn't as rosy as the propaganda made it seem. We were told that the corporate state, Mussolini's answer to Italy's economic troubles, would bring prosperity to the country, but I saw the poverty and struggle of the peasants in the countryside. They were living on the margins, working the land with little to show for their efforts. The regime's promises of prosperity were a far cry from the reality of life for many Italians. Yet I was still caught up in the excitement of it all. The public works programs, the new stadiums, the grand buildings. We were told that these were the symbols of Italy's resurgence. The battle for grain was one such program, and I watched as men and women worked the fields as if their hard work was the foundation of Italy's greatness. It felt noble, even if the reality of it was something far less glamorous. I watched my father struggle more and more as the regime's promises seemed to fall short, but he never spoke out. There was no room for dissent. and those who spoke too loudly were quickly silenced. The Fascist Party wasn't just a political movement, it had become a way of life. It dictated what we wore, how we thought, how we acted, and if you weren't a part of it, if you didn't fit the mold, there was no place for you in this new Italy. I remember walking through town, seeing the black shirts patrolling the streets, making sure that everyone was in line. I began to understand that dissent wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Fear of the regime's control began to seep into my consciousness, even if I couldn't admit it to myself at the time. As the years passed, it became harder to ignore the contradictions of Mussolini's regime. On the one hand, we were told that Italy was strong and united under Il Duce's leadership. But on the other, there were stories, whispers, about those who had been disappeared, about people who had been arrested or sent away for speaking out against Mussolini. I didn't know much about politics at the time, but I knew enough to see that not everything was as perfect as they told us. Yet, even in the face of these contradictions, I remained loyal. I still believed in the dream Mussolini had sold to us, even though the cracks were starting to show. The fascist regime had become my world. I didn't question it, I believed in it. But there were moments when I felt a creeping discomfort, moments when I wondered if we were really building a new Italy or if we were just being swept along in a wave of propaganda and fear. By the time I was 25, Mussolini's ambitions had grown more pronounced, and I found myself swept up in the tide of his expanding vision for Italy. In 1935, he launched the invasion of Ethiopia, a war that would come to define much of the regime's foreign policy. At first, like many young men in Italy, I felt a kind of patriotic excitement. Ethiopia was weak, and our empire was expanding. The very idea of Italy building a new Roman Empire, just as Mussolini promised, seemed almost romantic, an ancient noble cause. The streets filled with banners proclaiming our military might, and the people, excited by the propaganda, waved their flags. It felt as if Italy was about to return to the glory of the Roman days. I was drafted into the military that same year. I was no longer just a boy in the streets of Bologna, playing at loyalty, at pride in my country. I was now a soldier, prepared to give my life for this great new Italy. My initial excitement was palpable. I had been a part of the youth movements. I had saluted Il Duce in school, and now I was going to do my part for the country I had been taught to love. The journey to Ethiopia was grueling. The heat, the dust, and the exhaustion seemed endless, but there was still a sense of purpose. We were there to conquer, to bring Italy's glory to the African continent. But when we reached the front lines, the reality of the war hit hard. The conditions were harsher than anything I had imagined. The Ethiopian terrain, with its harsh mountains and wide open spaces, offered little in terms of cover or comfort. And the Ethiopians, though poorly equipped, fought fiercely, their resistance something I had not expected. The horror of the war settled into my bones like the suffocating heat. The further we pushed into Ethiopia, the more brutal the fighting became. I had heard the rumors about the use of chemical weapons, mustard gas that would burn your skin and lungs. I didn't want to believe them at first, but when I saw it firsthand, when I saw the men in my unit, soldiers I had known for years, struggling to breathe, their faces burning red and blistered, I realized that we were committing atrocities. Mussolini told us that the Ethiopians were savages, that we were bringing civilization to them. but I couldn't reconcile that message with the sight of men and women, innocent civilians, caught in the devastation of our invasion, the women and children who fled into the hills, the men who stood and fought until they were mowed down by machine guns. The Ethiopian resistance, desperate as it was, never surrendered. And we pressed on, pushed by the belief that we were doing the right thing. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this war wasn't what I had been told it was. I remember the day I was ordered to march into a village that had been devastated by our forces. The people were gone, either killed or forced to flee, and the homes had been burned to the ground. The air was thick with smoke, and the smell of burning flesh lingered in the hot wind. I saw a boy no older than 10, his face stained with ash, standing among the ruins. I approached him, wanting to ask where his family had gone, but he just stared at me, his eyes hollow and empty. There was nothing I could say. How could I apologize for this? How could I justify the horrors we were visiting on these people? The propaganda we had been fed painted our actions as noble, but standing in that village, I felt nothing but shame. By the time we returned to Italy, Mussolini had celebrated our victory. The Ethiopian conquest had been a symbol of Italian strength, but for me it was a hollow achievement. We had conquered land, yes, but we had done so through violence, through lies, and through cruelty. Mussolini, in his speeches, told us that Italy was great again, that the Roman Empire had been reborn. But to me it felt like a betrayal, not of Ethiopia, but of the Italy I had been raised to believe in. The war in Ethiopia was only the beginning of Mussolini's foreign ambitions. His alliance with Nazi Germany, driven by the vision of a strong, united Axis, began to draw Italy deeper into the web of Europe's impending conflicts. By 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, Italy was already on the brink of being dragged into another war. I was no longer a young man filled with the naive pride of fascism. The disillusionment I felt after Ethiopia had begun to settle in, and I could feel the pressure building from within and without. Mussolini's alliance with Hitler, his growing militarism, and the promises of empire all felt like an unstoppable machine, a machine that was out of our control. I began to hear whispers from the men in my unit, men who had served in the trenches during the Great War, who had seen the horrors of conflict firsthand. Another war, they would say, but this time we won't come back. But there was no stopping it. Mussolini had cast his lot with Hitler. The Pact of Steel in 1939 made our alliance official, binding us to the German cause. And once again, Italy found itself on the wrong side of history, pulled into a conflict it could neither win nor control. Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire was fading fast. Instead of restoring Italy to greatness, he had brought us to the brink of disaster. I remember the day war was declared, June 10th, 1940. Mussolini stood before the people, declaring that Italy would join Germany in the fight against the Allies. It was a moment of historical weight, a moment that should have filled us with pride. But for me, and for many others, it felt like the beginning of the end. I could see it in the faces of the people in the streets, uncertain, unsure, afraid. We were going to war, but this time it was different. The optimism that had once been so strong was gone. What had we fought for? What had Mussolini promised us, if not a lie? By 1940, I could feel it. The country was beginning to unravel. The dreams of empire had turned to dust, and Italy was facing the harsh reality of war. a war that, for many of us, seemed doomed from the start. By 1940, I had become a man caught between duty and doubt, between the allure of Mussolini's promises and the harsh realities that came with war. Italy's alliance with Nazi Germany had bound us tightly into a web of conflict, and the declaration of war on the Allies was the final step down a path that many of us had already started to regret. Mussolini had painted the war as our grand opportunity to carve out an empire, to secure Italy's place in history as a powerful nation. But what I saw in the following years was nothing like the victory we had been promised. We were stationed in Libya, a dusty, desolate land that I had never imagined I would find myself in. It wasn't the glory I had been promised. Instead, it was a struggle for survival. I was part of the Italian forces sent to assist in the North African campaign to push the British out of Egypt and secure the Suez Canal. I thought of it as a test, a trial of our strength, but what I encountered was something else entirely. The desert sun beat down on us mercilessly, and the endless sand made it hard to tell where the war even was, let alone what we were fighting for. We had little to no support, our supply lines stretched thin, and our equipment was outdated. Mussolini had promised us glory, but the reality was different. The British were formidable opponents, and their forces in North Africa were far better equipped than ours. Our soldiers, ill-prepared for the brutal conditions of the desert, were falling fast. The heat, the hunger, and the constant fear of airstrikes wore us down. The few victories we claimed were hollow, temporary, and our advances were always short-lived. I remember the look in the eyes of my comrades, men who had come to the war with hopes of victory, now disillusioned, their faces lined with exhaustion and doubt. The British pushed us back. The battle for North Africa felt endless, and every time we gained ground, we were forced to retreat. It wasn't just the enemy we fought now, it was the relentless environment. Food was scarce, water was even more precious, and disease spread like wildfire. Men began to die from heat stroke, from malnutrition, from the overwhelming exhaustion of being in a war we were not prepared to win. We had been sold a lie, told that we were building an empire, but all we were building was a graveyard for our hopes. Meanwhile, back home, the propaganda machine continued its work. Mussolini's speeches rang through the airwaves, talking of victory, of Italian glory. But in the trenches, in the deserts, I couldn't see it. The government continued to sell its vision of a powerful Italy, but for those of us in the field, we were becoming increasingly aware of the disconnect. We were being sent to die for a dream that was already fading while the world around us collapsed. And then, in 1941, came the entry of Nazi Germany into the Soviet Union. Mussolini, eager to align with Hitler's war against the Bolsheviks, sent us to the Eastern Front. As if things weren't bad enough, we were thrown into a conflict that was even worse. The harsh Russian winter tore into our already depleted forces. The cold was something I had never known, and I can still feel the frostbite creeping into my fingers as I tried to hold my rifle. The Soviets were relentless, and the Russian landscape was unforgiving. We were caught between two worlds, the burning heat of the desert and the freezing cold of the Russian steppes. Both felt like death traps. It wasn't just the physical conditions that wore us down, it was the realization that we were being led into these campaigns by a man who had long since lost touch with reality. Mussolini's promises of glory now seemed hollow, the speeches empty. We weren't building an empire, we were losing men, wasting resources, and being forced to fight for a cause that seemed further from the truth every day. By 1943, the cracks in Italy's fascist facade began to show. Mussolini's grip on the country weakened. The Allies had landed in Sicily, and the war was no longer a distant conflict fought far from home. The bombs fell on Italian soil. The city of Palermo was bombed relentlessly, and for the first time I could feel the reality of the war striking not just our military, but our homes. The people, who had once marched in line behind Mussolini, were now watching as their cities burned. There was no escaping it. Italy was unraveling, and the dream of empire was collapsing under the weight of failure. At the front, morale had fallen to its lowest point. I watched as men who had once shouted Mussolini's name with pride now questioned the cause they were fighting for. Some whispered about surrender, about ending the war. Others, still loyal, marched on with grim determination, but it was clear that the fascist dream was dying. Mussolini, once the symbol of Italian strength, had become the embodiment of failure. The regime's promise of greatness had led us down a path of ruin, and we were now left with the consequences of our misplaced faith. I remember the day we received the news that Mussolini had been arrested. It felt like the world was shifting under my feet. For so long, I had believed in the ideals of fascism, in the promises of a new Italy. But in that moment, I realized that it had all been a lie. We had been sent to fight, to die for a man who had failed us. The collapse of Mussolini's regime wasn't just a political failure, it was a betrayal. We had given our lives for something that had never been real. As the war raged on, the landscape of Italy changed. The Allies invaded and Mussolini's fascist forces fractured. The country that had once been united under a single powerful leader was now a shattered nation. The Italian people who had suffered for so long under Mussolini's promises were left to pick up the pieces of a broken dream. And I, like many others, was left with the haunting realization that we had been part of something that had ultimately led to nothing. The summer of 1943 brought with it a quiet sense of inevitability, a feeling that the storm we had long sensed was finally here. I had seen the cracks in Mussolini's regime for years, but it wasn't until that summer that the facade truly crumbled. The Allies had landed in Sicily, and the southern part of Italy was on fire, quite literally. We could hear the distant rumble of bombers overhead, the sound of destruction growing louder and more frequent. But it was the whispers in the streets, the nervous conversations behind closed doors that told me the true story. The end was coming. I remember the day the news broke. Mussolini had been arrested, ousted by his own people. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, had finally decided that the cost of supporting Mussolini had outweighed the benefits. There were no celebrations, no cheers in the streets, just a stunned silence. For the first time, I felt a deep, unsettling emptiness. The man we had followed for so long, the man who had promised to lead us to glory, was no longer in power. I had spent so many years believing in Mussolini, in the dream of a new Italy, but now I had to face the reality of what we had become. Italy's surrender came quickly after that. The country was divided, half under German control, half controlled by the Allies, and the resistance was growing stronger in the south. The people were confused, frightened, unsure of who they could trust. As the war raged on and Mussolini's name became a distant echo, The country began to fracture in a way that seemed impossible just a year before. Fascism was no longer the unifying force it once was. It had become a dirty word, a symbol of everything we had lost. For many of us, the collapse of Mussolini's regime wasn't just political, it was personal. I had grown up in the shadow of fascism, had given so much to it, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered beliefs. The loyalty that had once seemed so certain now felt like a burden. I was angry, but not just at Mussolini. I was angry at myself. How could I have been so blind? How could I have believed in the promises of a man who had led us down this path? But even as I wrestled with my disillusionment, I knew there was no going back. The war had torn Italy apart, and now we were left to deal with the consequences. In the streets, people fought not only the Germans, but also each other. The resistance movement, once a small group of partisans, had grown into a force that couldn't be ignored. I watched as former fascists now turned their allegiances to the Allies, some out of genuine regret, others just seeking to survive. The lines between good and evil, between right and wrong, were blurred. Everyone was trying to figure out where they belonged in this new Italy. It wasn't long before the Germans came for Mussolini. They rescued him from his imprisonment and set him up in northern Italy in the so-called Italian Social Republic. They made him their puppet, a shadow of the man he had once been. The irony was not lost on me. The same man who had promised to restore Italy to greatness was now just a tool in the hands of the enemy. Mussolini, the proud dictator, was now reduced to nothing more than a puppet. I wondered how he felt, standing in front of the German officers, unable to do anything but follow their orders. Was there any pride left in him, or was he as broken as the rest of us? I didn't want to be part of the new Italy that Mussolini tried to create in the north. But I couldn't help but feel the pull of history, the weight of the years we had all spent under his rule. Some people still believed in him, still followed him blindly, but I couldn't. I had seen too much to believe in the dream anymore. It wasn't just the war crimes we had committed in Ethiopia or the failures in North Africa. It was the betrayal of our own people, the lies we had been fed about the greatness of Italy. It was the realization that the country I had fought for was no longer the country I recognized. As the war dragged on, I began to see the cracks in the Axis alliance, the distrust between Italy and Germany. The Germans, who had once been our allies, now controlled us, dictating our movements, our policies, our every move. I could see the growing resentment in the eyes of the people. Resentment not just towards Mussolini, but towards the war itself. People were tired, weary, and desperate for an end to the conflict. The fear of German reprisals kept most of us silent, but there was a growing underground movement, a sense of rebellion that had been buried beneath the surface for years. The resistance had grown, and it was no longer just a handful of men in the shadows. It was the people of Italy rising up, fighting against the Germans, fighting against the regime that had once promised them so much. It was in these final days, as Mussolini's puppet government collapsed and the Allies continued their push north, that I began to see the future of Italy, if we survived at all. The question was no longer whether fascism would rise again. It was whether Italy could ever recover from the damage it had inflicted upon itself. I had lived through the rise of fascism, the promises, the victories, and the betrayals. But now I was left to face a different reality, a broken country, a shattered identity, and the knowledge that I had been part of something that had failed us all. The days after Mussolini's fall felt like a dream, disorienting, surreal, like the end of an era. The summer of 1943 had brought the Allied invasion to Sicily, and with it the realization that Italy was now divided, a country torn in half by war. The fascist dream had died with Mussolini's arrest, but the consequences were far from over. The reality of occupation, of being caught between two warring forces, was something none of us had truly prepared for. There was no clear enemy anymore, only the ruins of a nation that had once believed it was destined for greatness. The war, which had once felt so distant when I was a young man, had become personal. The German occupation in the north, the chaos in the south, the constant bombardments from the Allies, all of it collided in a terrifying and confusing whirlpool. I had joined the resistance partly out of a sense of duty, partly because I no longer recognized the country I was fighting for. The partisans were not just fighting the Germans, they were fighting the ghosts of Mussolini's regime and the silent complicity of so many who had stood by while fascism consumed Italy. But the partisans, like us, were also fractured. Some were former soldiers of the regime, their faces still bearing the scars of war. Others were former socialists, communists, and liberals, all united now by the common cause of liberation, but distrustful of each other's pasts. I remember joining a group of partisans in the hills of Tuscany, trying to understand how we could heal a country that had been divided by Mussolini's vision. We fought bravely, but we were always outnumbered, outgunned, and often left to make do with whatever we could find, old weapons, outdated supplies, and meager rations. It wasn't glory I sought in the mountains, it was survival. It was the hope that once the war was over, Italy could begin to rebuild itself. There was a sense of camaraderie among us, but it was tempered with the knowledge that we were in a race against time. The Germans were everywhere in the north, their occupation tightening like a noose, and their reprisals against the population were brutal. The cities we had once called home were bombed and burned, reduced to rubble. As a young man, I had believed that Mussolini's Italy would stand tall in history. Now all I saw were the wreckage of our cities, the bloodshed in the streets, and the faces of the innocent caught in the crossfire. In the midst of all this, there were moments of hope, small flickers in the darkness. I remember one night as we huddled in a ruined farmhouse, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, when a fellow partisan, an older man named Giulio, spoke of the future. "We may never see it," he said, "but one day this will end. Italy will rise from the ashes, not fascism, not this regime, but something new, something free." His words, though whispered in the dark, stuck with me. I had spent years watching the rise and fall of dreams, the collapse of an empire that was never meant to be. But maybe Giulio was right. Maybe in the end Italy could be rebuilt. It would take time, it would take sacrifices, even more bloodshed, but it could happen. Yet, as I learned from my comrades and from the stories we heard from the cities, rebuilding was not something that could happen overnight. The country was fractured, divided not just by geography, but by ideology. The fascists who had once ruled were now trying to salvage what they could, some rallying around Mussolini's puppet regime in the north, others retreating to their homes, trying to avoid the fury of the partisans. And the rest of the population, those who had been silent for so long, Those who had gone along with the regime's promises of prosperity now had to confront their own complicity in the nightmare that had unfolded. Guilt, doubt, and fear filled the air, and the scars of Mussolini's rule were everywhere. The people in the cities, especially in Rome, were restless. They had endured years of oppression, of fascist rallies, of surveillance by the Ovra, of denunciations and betrayals. The partisans scattered across the mountains had their work cut out for them. We fought hard, but even as we pushed back the German forces and liberated small villages, there was no certainty. No one knew what the future held for us, and I began to wonder if I had any place in this new Italy. Would I ever truly be free of the ghosts of fascism? Could I ever live in a country that had been so fundamentally altered by Mussolini's dreams? As the war raged on, the mood in the resistance grew darker. The Germans were losing ground, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a long, drawn-out defeat. The Allies were closing in, but their arrival was a bitter reminder of how far Italy had fallen. We had fought for liberation, but in the back of my mind, I questioned what we were fighting for. Were we just fighting to replace one occupation with another? Could we rebuild a country that had been so deeply scarred? The Italians I met in the resistance were not the ones who had blindly followed Mussolini. They were the ones who had lived through the horrors of fascism and still believed in the possibility of redemption. But as we fought on, the realization grew that redemption wasn't a simple thing. We had been promised greatness, and instead we had been left with nothing but ruin. The fascist ideal had crumbled, and in its place a new question arose. What would Italy become after the war? By 1944, the war was nearing its end, and Italy was a nation divided, not just by geography, but by the scars of fascism. The question of what Italy could become, what we could rebuild, lingered in the air. Could we build a new Italy, one free of the shadow of Mussolini's regime? Or would we continue to be haunted by the past, never able to fully escape the wounds it had inflicted on us? As I sat in the mountains, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and hearing the distant echoes of battle, I realized that the war had taken more from me than just my youth. It had taken my innocence, my belief in the ideals of fascism, and it had left me with a bitter sense of regret. I had fought for something that turned out to be a lie, but in the midst of all that loss, there was still hope. Hope that perhaps Italy could rebuild itself. By 1944, Italy was a country of rubble and broken dreams. The streets were littered with the remnants of what once seemed like an empire on the rise. Fascism had promised us a renewed Italy, but all that remained were the echoes of its failed ambitions. The war had torn the country apart, and now, in the final days of the conflict, we were living in a fractured nation, a nation divided not just by geography, but by the political and moral scars of Mussolini's rule. I had seen enough of war by this point. The violence, the bloodshed, it all felt like a distant memory, like the very land itself had grown tired of the endless cycle of conflict. But even as the Allies advanced from the south, the Germans remained entrenched in the north, and Mussolini, that once proud leader, had been resurrected in the form of the Italian Social Republic. The puppet state set up by Hitler was nothing more than a cruel joke. Mussolini, who had once held Italy in his grip, was now nothing more than a tool, a desperate man clinging to the last vestiges of power. I had joined the resistance long ago, hoping to undo the wrongs that Mussolini's regime had inflicted on our people. But now, with the end of the war in sight, I wasn't sure what I was fighting for anymore. The idea of Italy rising from the ashes had seemed noble, but I had seen enough to realize that rebuilding a country doesn't happen overnight. The war had shattered us. It had stripped away the illusions we had built around our national pride and left us with the harsh truth. Italy was a broken nation, and even after the war it wouldn't be the same. I still remember the day Mussolini was captured. The war had been dragging on for what seemed like eternity, and as I stood in the countryside watching the smoke rise from the cities we had fought so hard to liberate, I heard the news. Mussolini, once the great leader who had promised Italy's rebirth, was now a prisoner, caught by the partisans in the mountains. It was almost surreal. For so many years I had believed in his vision, in the dream of fascism. But now, in his final moments, he was nothing more than a man, desperate and defeated, clinging to whatever power he could still hold. The moment of his capture wasn't celebrated by all. There was no joy in the streets. In fact, many of us were left with a hollow feeling. The man we had once followed so blindly had fallen, but his fall didn't bring the satisfaction I had expected. It wasn't the triumph I had imagined in my youth. Instead, it felt like the end of something that had been broken from the beginning, a vision that could never be realized. Mussolini, once the symbol of Italy's strength, was now a symbol of failure. I remember hearing the whispers as the news spread. Mussolini was to be executed. The man who had once claimed to be the father of the nation, the savior of Italy, was now condemned to die by the very people who had once followed him. His death was inevitable, but it was also the final act of a tragedy. His body was hung upside down in the streets of Milan, along with his mistress Clara Petacci. It was a gruesome display, a final insult to the man who had once ruled with an iron fist. I didn't feel joy, I didn't feel relief, all I felt was emptiness. It was the end of an era, but it was not the end of the pain. In the wake of Mussolini's death, the country was left to pick up the pieces. The partisans had won, and the Allies were closing in on the last remnants of the German forces. But even as the war wound down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the wounds Mussolini's regime had inflicted on Italy would never truly heal. The political divisions, the moral compromises, and the devastation of the war had left Italy a broken shell of what it once was. In the final months of the war, as the Allies pushed north, I fought not for glory or honor, but for survival. I had watched too many friends die, too many lives shattered by the regime's ambitions. I no longer cared about what Italy would become after the war. The country I had once believed in was gone, and as I fought alongside the partisans, my thoughts turned to the future, to the Italy we would rebuild, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. The war had changed us all. We would never be the same. When the war finally ended in May 1945, I stood in the streets, not with a sense of triumph, but with the quiet realization that the true cost of this war was more than I could ever have imagined. Mussolini was gone, but the damage his regime had caused, both to Italy and to the people who had lived under it, was far from over. Italy would rebuild, but it would take time. And for many of us, the war didn't end with the surrender of the Germans. It lingered in our minds, in our hearts, and in the streets we had once called home. The war was over. The cities were still smoldering, and the earth beneath us was as scarred as our souls. In the aftermath of Mussolini's death and the fall of the fascist regime, the Italy I had once known, the Italy I had fought for, no longer existed. Our once proud nation lay in ruins, physically and morally shattered. It wasn't just the infrastructure that had been destroyed. It was the very idea of Italy itself. I had spent so many years believing in the promises of fascism, in the vision of a new Italy, and now all that was left was the painful wreckage of our collective dream. In the months following Mussolini's death, Italy was left to rebuild, not just from the wreckage of war, but from the wreckage of its own identity. The country was divided into factions: partisans, former fascists, the church, the monarchy, communists, and socialists. Each group had its own idea of what Italy should become, and each was determined to make its vision a reality. For a man like me, who had grown up under the influence of Mussolini's fascism, it was hard to know where I fit in this new world. I joined the ranks of the Italian resistance during the war, hoping to fight against the Nazis and liberate Italy from its oppressors. But now that the war was over, the lines had blurred. Who were we fighting for now? The partisans, once united in their opposition to fascism, were divided by ideology. Some believed in a socialist vision for Italy, while others, like myself, just wanted a country free from the tyranny of the past. I couldn't reconcile the ideal of a new Italy with the divisions I saw in our society. The bitter reality of war had torn Italy apart, and rebuilding felt like an impossible task. The presence of the Allies in our country only complicated matters further. They were supposed to be our liberators, but their occupation felt like a new kind of oppression. The Italians who had been loyal to Mussolini were now left to reckon with their past, with the people they had supported, the policies they had upheld. And those who had resisted fascism, who had fought for Italy's freedom, now found themselves caught in a struggle for political power. The monarchy, which had supported Mussolini for so long, was under siege from all sides, while communists and socialists pushed for a new, more radical Italy. The Church, which had been complicit in Mussolini's rise to power through the Lateran Treaty, now tried to distance itself from the regime. For me, these struggles felt like a never-ending cycle. Italy had fought the war against fascism, but now it seemed as though we were fighting among ourselves. We had lost everything: our unity, our sense of purpose, and our pride. I remember walking through the ruined streets of Milan, seeing people who had once cheered Mussolini now shunned and silent, too afraid to show their faces in public. The partisans had liberated the city, but the cost had been high. The streets were filled with uncertainty. Those who had once supported the regime now found themselves branded as traitors. The people were divided. Some celebrated the downfall of Mussolini, while others mourned the loss of their vision for Italy. I spent my days working in the resistance, trying to rebuild what I could, but it felt like an impossible task. The economy was in shambles, and the social fabric was torn apart. The countryside where my family had lived for generations was no better off. The agricultural campaigns that Mussolini had promoted had failed. The land was barren, and the farmers struggled to grow enough food to feed their families. The promises of the fascist regime had turned out to be lies. Autarky had failed. Economic self-sufficiency was a mirage. Italy was dependent on outside aid, and we were now at the mercy of the Allies and their plans for our future. I remember the moment I realized that Italy would never be the same. The monarchy, which had once been a pillar of Italy's unity, was now under fire. The king had fled to Brindisi during the war, and his return was met with skepticism. The people who had once revered him now viewed him as a symbol of Italy's failure. In 1946, a referendum was held and the monarchy was abolished. Italy became a republic, but I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. The monarchy, for all its flaws, had been a part of our identity for centuries. The new republic, which was supposed to bring hope and renewal, felt like a fragile thing, held together by political compromises and shaky alliances. And yet, even as I grappled with these feelings of loss, I also saw a glimmer of hope. The younger generation, those who had not been tainted by the fascist regime, were beginning to emerge. They had no attachment to the old ideals of Mussolini, no loyalty to the monarchy. They were creating a new identity for Italy, one that was still in the process of being shaped. The fascist past was slowly being pushed aside, and the nation was beginning to forge a new path, even if it was uncertain. It was a long road ahead, but the future was not as bleak as it had seemed in the darkest days of the war. In the years that followed, Italy slowly began to rebuild itself. The scars of fascism would never fully heal, but the country started to move forward inch by inch. I found myself caught between the old world and the new. The memories of the war, of Mussolini, of the broken promises still haunted me, but I also saw the potential for change, for something better. The wounds of the past could not be erased, but perhaps in time they could be healed. The Italy I had once believed in was gone, but in its place was the chance to build something new, something more honest, something more free. As I reflect on those years now, from the distance of time, I realize that Italy's journey was never meant to be easy. The road to freedom, to self-determination, was always going to be filled with challenges. The rise and fall of Mussolini's regime was just one chapter in a long and tumultuous history. The future of Italy and of its people was never going to be defined by one man, one ideology, or one war. It was always going to be defined by the resilience of the people who lived through it, who fought for it, and who, despite everything, believed that Italy could rise again. The years after the war seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if time itself had slowed down in the wake of the destruction. Italy, now a republic, began to piece itself together, but the scars of the past remained etched deeply in the minds of the people. For me, these years were a time of reflection, a time when the memories of my youth, the promises of Mussolini, and the crushing weight of disillusionment all seemed to collide in a swirling haze. The country was rebuilding itself, yes, but I found it hard to let go of the past. The trauma of war, of fascism, and of the betrayals that came with it was something that stayed with me, a constant presence in my thoughts. The early days of the Republic were filled with hope, but also with uncertainty. Italy was now under the influence of the Allied powers, and I could feel the political tension in the air. The communists and socialists were gaining strength, while the Christian Democrats, backed by the church, struggled to hold on to power. The new Constitution had been ratified in 1948, and the Republic was born in the shadow of the war. But for all its promise, the Republic seemed fragile, a fragile idea held together by fragile alliances. It was hard to shake the feeling that we were still struggling to find ourselves, still grappling with the weight of our own history. I worked in the fields, like my father had done, trying to rebuild what little we could. The countryside had been devastated by the war, and the remnants of fascist propaganda were still visible in the decaying walls of old buildings. We were trying to cultivate the land again, but it was a struggle. The state had promised to restore Italy's agricultural strength, but the truth was that the farmers were still suffering. The government's promises, though well-meaning, seemed to fall short. I had seen what Mussolini's regime had promised, the battle for grain, the dream of self-sufficiency, and now I saw the reality. The fields lay barren, the soil exhausted from years of warfare, and the people were weary. I tried to find meaning in the new Italy, to reconcile the dreams I had held as a young man with the disillusionment I now felt. I attended political meetings, listened to the speeches of those who now claim to be leading the country toward a new future. I met with the communists, the socialists, the Christian Democrats, trying to understand where I, as a man who had lived through fascism, could find my place. Each group promised something different. Some wanted a socialist future, others a Christian democratic one. But all of them seemed to be grappling with the same question. What was the price of rebuilding a country that had lost so much? In these years, I began to hear the voices of those who had once been silent, the survivors of Mussolini's regime who had been forced to watch as the world around them crumbled. They spoke of their complicity in the regime, of the choices they had made. Some regretted their actions, others still clung to the belief that fascism had been the right path for Italy. It was a bitter conversation, one that I couldn't escape, because I had lived through it all. I had fought in the war, believed in Mussolini, and now I was left to reckon with my own role in the tragedy of our past. I didn't speak much of it to my family. My father had passed away a few years before, his health deteriorating in the years following the war. He had lived long enough to see Mussolini fall and to hear the arguments over Italy's future, but he had never fully embraced the new republic. He had seen too much, and the wounds of the past were too deep. My mother, on the other hand, was still hopeful, still clung to the belief that Italy could rise again, that the worst was behind us. I could see the fear in her eyes when she spoke of the future, a fear that we would never fully escape the war, the fascism that had torn the country apart. But it was in the quiet moments, in the silence of the night, that I confronted my own struggle. I was caught between the weight of history and the desire to move forward. I had lost so much, the country I had believed in, the ideals I had once held dear, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. The fascist past was a burden I couldn't escape. It was like a shadow that followed me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the choices I had made, the choices my country had made. As the years passed, Italy began to find its place in the world again. The economy started to recover, aided by the Marshall Plan, and the country began to rebuild its industrial base. The post-war years were marked by rapid modernization, by the promise of a new, more prosperous Italy. But for me, the scars of the past remained. I could see the growth, the new factories, the bustling cities, but I couldn't forget the pain, the memory of war, of the men I had lost, of the lives destroyed by Mussolini's vision, haunted me. I tried to hold on to the hope that Italy could be different, that the future could be different, but the burden of memory was heavy. I had lived through a time when promises were made, promises that turned out to be lies. I had believed in the dream of fascism, only to watch it collapse in ruin. And now, as the new Italy emerged, I wondered if it was just another dream, another illusion that would eventually fade. In these years, I began to understand the true cost of war, not just the physical destruction, but the emotional toll it took on those who lived through it. The generations that followed would never know the Italy I had grown up in, an Italy that had been consumed by its own ambitions. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The past could never be erased. It would always be with us, lingering in the shadows, shaping the choices we made. The years that followed the war felt like a slow march toward some kind of reckoning, though I wasn't sure what that reckoning would look like. By the 1950s, Italy was beginning to rebuild, both physically and politically. The scars of Mussolini's regime, the war and the trauma of the years under Fascism still lingered, but Italy was moving forward. The country had joined the European community, the economy was gradually recovering, and the industrial boom was creating new opportunities for many Italians. For the first time in years, there was a sense of hope, though it felt different than the optimism I had felt as a young man. The new republic, though fragile and deeply scarred, was beginning to show signs of life. We had rid ourselves of Mussolini, but the influence of his legacy, both in terms of ideology and in the way the country had been shaped by his rule, still ran deep. The divisions that had once defined Italy, between the North and South, between the working class and the bourgeoisie, between communists and the Christian Democrats, were still very much present. But in the quiet of everyday life, you could feel something changing. We were trying to find our way forward, to reconcile with the past, but the path forward was uncertain.